Hello, Herbal community. I'm really excited to be sitting here in this herbal garden with visiting herbalist Maureen Robertson. She's made her way here from Scotland and Portugal, and I think maybe some other paths have brought her here. She was here to teach a workshop on Goethean Plant Study, and I spent the day with her yesterday and learned a lot. And I'd like to introduce this herbalist to you, and just to hear what your life has been like as a herbalist. Just talk us through what some of your adventures have been on this path.
Well, I think I've been very blessed to find a passion that I can make a living from. And then I always say to my students and to my children, if you can find something that you really love to do, then and that can become your work, then it doesn't feel like work. So I think I've been very blessed to have found this path quite early on in my life, and you never stop learning, and you get to meet wonderful other herbalists like yourself. And this trip that we've been on a North American tour since the beginning of July, so that's nearly a month, and we've been hosted by the most amazing herbalists. So you introduced us to the herbal community here in Nova Scotia, but the herbal community is absolutely global. And I think once you meet somebody else that has a love for plants, then you want to, there's going to be some kind of sharing. And it's wonderful that we're able to actually manifest it in a physical way with this interview. But I've had such wonderful meetings and remarkable conversations with remarkable herbalists these last few weeks. So I'm really grateful for the global herbal community, that we can host each other and share with each other and learn from each other.
Okay, so where on the globe are you situated now as a herbalist? Where do you do a lot of your work currently?
I've been living in the southwest corner of Algarve, which is the most southerly region of Portugal, and we're about 20 kilometers away from Sagres Point, which is the most southerly and westerly point of mainland Europe. And it's a really interesting area because you're literally on the threshold of one continent, and there's this massive history of all the explorers and adventurers setting off from the Iberian Peninsula to the New World, where we are now. And so it's quite an interesting part of the world to live, because with that massive ocean in front, on that threshold, on the edge, you literally feel like you're on the edge of something, and that's a really that's a point of high potential in a way. I think it kind of brings an edge and brings a drive to be in a really interesting landscape.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, we can relate to that here in Nova Scotia, being on the ocean, and you're from Scotland, correct?
I've spent most of my life. I've spent over 25 years living in Scotland, and I went up there to do my masters originally, and then I was exploring herbal medicine already at that point. When I did my first degree, which was in pharmacology, I was interested in how medicines affect us, how medicines have a biological action, and I made my way into this aspect, this way in through pharmacology. It was a 3-year program in London. And part of the degree program was that they allowed you to have a student placement in the industry. And of course, the drug companies, the pharmaceutical companies, are the industry for the subject of pharmacology. And there was the possibility of going to Switzerland instead of going to somewhere in the UK where I was studying. There was this possibility of Switzerland on the French-German border. And I decided that I would love to do that, have the experience of being in Europe, in the centre of Europe for a year. But when I got there, I was totally shocked by the reality of vivisection and animal experimentation for medical purposes. And it just didn't sit well with me at all. And there was a bit of dialogue had to take place with the university representative and the industrial representative, and in the end up I I stayed on to do a kind of standard follow-up to a drug that they had already researched and trademarked, and they just had to do kind of like top-up research. So they kind of sent me away into a test tube lab and to keep me there because it doesn't cost them as much to pay a student as another worker, and the university didn't want to lose their contact. So I ended up staying there because I'd already met lots of other students who were also doing a work placement, and not just pharmacology students, but pharmacy students, computer students, marketing students. So it was an interesting time of my life socially, but more importantly, it woke me up to what goes on in the medical system in terms of drug development, and it always involves animal research because the laws dictate that. And there was a primate lab in this particular department, and it was such an eye-opener for me. And it was so obvious to me that it was so wrong to be having animals suffering in the name of health. And my question then was, well, where did we get this so wrong? How did it come to this point? And I came to the conclusion that it was when we thought we knew better than nature. We could do better than nature. And of course, there's the financial profiteering drive that's part of it. But basically, it was that. So I kind of deconstructed a bit and took it a few steps back. And at the same time, in that library, which was a really incredible resource in that drug company, I found this journal called about ethnopharmacology, and that was my introduction to anthropologists interviewing indigenous people, finding out about potential medicinal plants, and then pharmacists coming in and doing all their testing to see how they can adapt it somehow to put a trademark on it and patent it. And so that was my introduction to herbal medicine, and it came about as a direct result of finding myself in this alien world of a drug company. And so that was what put me on my path to herbal medicine. And at the same time, across the road from this drug company, which had a massive building, 20 stories and high, was a meat factory that was processing meat animals from intensive factory farming, and the stench from this factory, which you had to walk past every day to get to the cafeteria. And it's like, okay, I get it, I get the message, because if I felt so strongly about the use of animals for medical research processes, then the same had to apply for how animals are treated in intensive factory farming. And so for me, I became vegan overnight at that point. And for me, herbal medicine and nutrition from plant-based nutrition have always been parallel and gone side by side. And so later, when I had qualified as a herbalist, food as medicine was a really, really big piece for me. And now, 30 years later, both herbal medicine and veganism is becoming much more mainstream and and it's almost becoming fashionable in a way. And I think it's all good, whatever path takes you to that message is fine by me, so long as there's a consciousness and there's an action from that, and applying it in your life. So that is what got me on the road to herbal medicine and plant-based nutrition as well.
Right. Yes, the plants offer us so much, and you've been practicing this, using the plants, eating the plants, and like you and like me, we all come at herbal medicine from different directions and at different times in our lives. And I'm observing as well that people are really interested in herbal medicine now, and are wanting to connect with plants and learn a little bit about them, or learn a lot, for instance, by choosing to go to a herbal school. And I know that you operated a herbal college in Scotland for a number of years. How was that, and what was your takeaway away from that large experience?
Yeah, so when I completed that pharmacology degree, and it became clear to me that it was important that I did complete it and that I didn't just bail out because I didn't agree with it, because I realized that the only way you can make any changes or be an authority to have an opinion that will count is if you have been on the inside and you know what you're talking about. And so I made sure that I got through that hurdle of pushing through for the last year of the degree, so that I had a pharmacology degree and I could actually argue against the limitations and the horrors of vivisection, because it's pretty ludicrous to think that, like you and I sitting here, we're both humans, we're both females. We're kind of in the kind of similar age group, yet we have completely different constitutional types. We have completely different rates of absorption, metabolism, and elimination of anything. And to think that, you can use information from different species that are way different in those same parameters of how the biological action is. And think that you can just correlate that information and put it right next to a human being and say, oh, that's all good now. That's why we have so many side effects from drugs that have gone through all those preclinical, which is what they call the animal testing stage, and the clinical trials, which are usually on young, healthy male medical students. That's why we have so many side effects, because most medicines are given for chronic illnesses to older people whose metabolism is starting to decline and whose elimination rate is going down, and so these chemical substances are in the system for much longer and cause toxicity and side effects and all the rest of it. So that was one piece of it, and I really wanted to be able to argue that obvious, glaringly obvious point of fact. And it actually stood me in very good stead when we were having these academic meetings with the University of Wales, who ran a validation board for outside autonomous courses. So they would have representatives from various aspects related to the subject of the course, and so there would be this kind of like academic discussion to really check that you were going to be able to deliver an academic integrity for your students, and that you had you were able to have an academic argument about why you were choosing certain approaches or research methods or whatever. And that school, the Scottish School of Herbal Medicine, that I set up with my partner, who was a herbalist as well, in 1992. That was set up because at the time the only herbal medicine school in the UK, there was only one that was recognised by the main professional body, the National Institute of Medical Herbalists, and that course had been set up by the professional body. So that was set up in the 70s, and there was very much a heavy scientific aspect to it, because it was a clinical training as well as a botanical training. We were being trained as medical herbalists, and in the UK to this day we have the right of primary diagnosis that dates back to a charter by King Henry VIII. I hope that will continue. That training was actually quite scientifically weighted, because the idea was to try and produce herbalists that could talk in the same scientific language as doctors and try to maintain our status through the way we were trained. But it also meant that it paid lip service to this idea that, this herb is good for this illness or this ailment, and it's not as simplistic as that. In modern medicine, it is that this pill is good for this condition, which has its limitations, of course. But when you try to do that with herbs, they kind of don't let you, you know, because they are multitasking all the time like us, and they are also made up of the same building blocks as us, which is the four main physical elements of earth, water, fire, air. And so, you know, they are interacting on a much more fluid and yet sophisticated level, because you have the phenomena of a plant going into a body and recognizing whether, for example, the system is acidic or alkaline, and depending on that can actually change its mode of operation depending on the environment it finds itself in. And I think that's really fascinating, that plants literally exhibit intelligence like that. And so it's not a straightforward this plant for this condition, because you then have to ask the question, but what is the constitutional type of the person as well? What type of person is it, and what type of condition is it? You know, to say, oh, this herb is good for eczema, it's like, well, what type of eczema? Is it dry eczema? Is it wet eczema? Is the person dry? Is the person wet? You know, in terms of their temperament. And so it's just not as clear cut as that. No matter how easy people want to make it, it just doesn't. You don't get the same target rate that is possible when you use more of a traditional or energetic approach, where you're really considering the constitutional temperament of the person. You're also considering the constitutional temperament of the plant, and you're assessing the condition that they're presenting with in the same way. You know, in Ayurveda, for example, there's many different, there's fiery type asthma, there's dry type asthma, and there's wet type asthma, and you can apply that to all the different conditions in the body. So, you know, it's actually an art, it's not a science.
Yes. Well, and the study of herbal medicine can come through pharmacology, from clinical study, from medical science, from observation, from intuition, from personal experience, from traditional. So it's a vast learning opportunity. And I think, you know, as we mature as herbalists, we round out into all these aspects of exploring herbal medicine, which is, you know, why we love this path, because it's so versatile and dynamic. And I just want to touch on one of the methods that I know you featured at the Scottish School of Herbal Medicine, which was the Goethean Plant Study. And I know you've taken that away with you into your present you know, teachings in Portugal, and you're traveling with it here. What would be the I guess just to summarize what that method of study can bring to a herbal student?
Well, I think the context of how I got so turned on by Goethean science was that when I did my herbal, more scientific based training, you know, you go out as a young blood herbalist, you're super enthusiastic, you want to get your experience up, but you find very quickly that applying the herbs in the way that you've been taught of this herb for this condition is quite limiting, and you just don't get the right hit rate that you want to for your patients. And so I started supplementing my education after, it was like my own postgraduate training, after I'd qualified as a herbalist, by exploring the traditional energetic systems of Ayurveda, traditional Chinese medicine, humoral medicine. And at the same time and that's what motivated setting up the school, actually, because we wanted to have a platform that we could learn all these things, and if that could be made available to other people to make the whole thing practical and possible, then that made sense. That was a no-brainer in a way. So that was the reason why we set up the school, to supplement our own training. And make that available for other people. And shortly after we did that, I heard about this woman that listened to the plants, and she was living just across the central belt of Scotland. I was on the west coast, she was on the east coast. And when I met up with her, she had done a training in Switzerland at the Goetheanum, which is the main kind of international centre for Rudolf Steiner's spiritual science or anthroposophy. And he was very influenced by Goethe, who was Germany's bard, like Shakespeare in England and Rabbie Burns in Scotland. He was a genius with his poetry and with his playwriting, and was recognised as such. Whilst he was still alive, he was celebrated as a genius artist, and yet he was a polymath, and he had this great interest in natural phenomena, and because he was recognised, he had sponsorship, so that he had time to further his scientific studies, which he did when he was living in the north of Germany. And his first area of interest were the plants, and he was very interested in the archetypal plant, or what is it that lies behind all plants, which he saw as being the spiritual essence of the plant, and each plant would have its own individual living principle or essence. And so that's what he became really, really interested in, and he spent a lot of time drawing plants and really comparing them with each other. And he did a lot of traveling, and he saw, for example, if he was in the north of Germany and he saw yarrow growing in the forests and the edges of the forests in northern Germany, they would be lush and large plants like this at Gaspereau Herb Farm's garden, because they get a lot of good nourishment in the soil. And then he did this Italian journey. He called it his Italian sojourn, and he saw the same plants in the lush, shady forests of northern Germany, and then he travelled over the Alps and he saw the same plants at altitude. And then he travelled all the way down through Italy to Sicily, which is very arid, almost desert-like environment at the very south of Sicily, where he saw the same plants again, and they all looked different because of the external factors that were influencing them through the different climatic conditions. Yet there was some constant, that a constant feature that he still knew, well, that is yarrow, even though it's much reduced, or the leaves are different and more reduced, or the flowers are slightly different. And so that's what fascinated him, and he kind of linked that to the part of the plant, the constant part of the plant that is linked to the eternal, and the eternal and divine realms of the celestial heavens, and where we all originated from, and where we all go back to. So he saw this link between the cosmic influences that shape this mystery of the eternal life and the eternal source, and the creator of all, that is non-changing, is never changes. And he could see that in the plants, in this essence that shines through this constancy and this authenticity, despite externally changing factors and influences. So that was his drive, and he took that, he took it throughout all natural phenomena, not just the plant world. He also looked at landscapes, which he saw as a wholeness, like a whole community of living beings. He looked at the phenomena of colour in our world, and particularly the relationships between the different colours, like as you watch a sunrise or a sunset, and how the colours are changing all the time. And it's like, well, how does that come about? And he also was very interested in comparative anatomy, particularly of the mammals, with the 5-digit features, and also our own anatomy. And he was very he was intrigued by the metamorphosis that you see in nature. Like when we were looking at the gumweed, we could see the flower bud, we could see the opening bud with the waxy gum. We could then see the fully open flower, the gum's gone, and you've got this yellow sunflower-like disc with the Fibonacci nature series of spiral in it. And also we saw the leaves of the first year's growth, because it's a biannual, so it will develop leaves first in the first summer, and then the second summer, from a different part of the underground colony with all those rhizomes underground, will come the flowering stems. So he was really fascinated with the metamorphosis that you saw, particularly in the leaf expression, and he saw that was what was happening in human beings as well. And he did a lot of study on the human vertebrae, because we have quite different representatives of form in the human vertebrae. The cervical vertebrae for holding the head up, then the thoracic vertebrae interacting with the ribs, then the lumbar vertebrae supporting the midpoint of the body, and the sacrum and the tailbone. So, he was really interested in this metamorphosis that is constantly evolving and developing. And Rudolf Steiner was given the task of editing Goethe's scientific writings, which had just got shelved of, you can't be a genius in science as well as art, get over it, Goethe. But he actually was. And Rudolf Steiner read through all his scientific writings. It took him 12 years. He wrote a book called Goethean Science, and it basically informed and helped him shape what he then brought to the world, which was his spiritual science of anthroposophy. And my teacher, this woman that I mentioned, who was listening to plants, she had trained in the natural science section of the Goetheanum, following this whole impulse that had come from Goethe's scientific writings and then shaped by Rudolf Steiner. And she worked particularly with plants, but she would share her experiences of applying this method to all the different natural phenomena. So I trained with her, and we integrated Goethean science into our degree and master's program, which is where the school evolved into, like you're running your school now, and that you start with the introductory first year, and then you add on the next level with the second year, and then eventually you get your network of teachers, and you get clear the subject matter that you want to bring in as the module titles and the learning outcomes from that. And so we got our degree program validated by the University of Wales, that had a external validation unit. And once we got the degree validated, we went on to the master's degree, which was a research-based master's, and we wanted to bring in Goethean science and shamanism as relevant research methods for herbalists on a herbal master's program. And so we had to have this academic verification of that, because nobody had ever heard of that being involved in those research methods being utilized by a herbal degree program. And so we had to justify it, and we were able to do so because we had spent at that point nearly 20 years working with the Goethean method, and I had traveled to South America and had worked with shamans, and we were able to bring over people to illustrate how indigenous people work with the plants. And we had to give this argument that this is an academic valid method. These are academically valid methods. And because the mainframe research methods for herbs as medicinal agents would just get pigeonholed into the modern scientific method, which is the pharmacological method. There was this whole thing about how can you justify not using all that? You're wanting to put these alternative methods forward, but aren't you going to prejudice your students academically if you're not going to be providing labs and possible vivisection aspects and running clinical trials, which was prohibitively financially, that was prohibitive for us. And it wasn't relevant, more important. So with my background with that pharmacology, when I knew I was so compelled to finish that degree, and that gave me the authority to argue with this university board and with other pharmacology professors, and with a professor of pharmacognosy from the School of Pharmacy in London, who were there, who were on this moderating board, and who were there to verify that we were worthy of being given this free run to run this school, this course that would be awarded a degree at the end of it. When I was able to put forward the reasons why we were not going to be offering that as a mainstream research method for herbal medicine, was because of all those limitations that, you know, I touched on right at the beginning, and they basically couldn't argue with that. You know, and they knew that I had a pharmacology degree, and I was saying, look, you know, I know what goes on there.
Right. Yeah.
You know, and so they basically had to accept our premise for why that was not going to be the main research methods, and why these other ones we felt were much more relevant, and we wanted them to be there. And interestingly, during that meeting, when all this was being debated and being decided, it was summertime, like it was July, like now, and there was a thunderstorm coming over the city. We were in Glasgow having this in the Steiner School, in Glasgow Steiner School, where we had our lesson. We taught our weekend lessons and classes. And this thunderstorm was getting closer and closer as the arguments were kind of like hotting up. And at one point then, the thunder and lightning were right, the storm must have been right above the building, because the lightning strike and the thunder were like side by side. And there was this really dramatic elemental activity going on during this really important. It was kind of like groundbreaking discussion, you know, of herbalists standing up for how we want to work that fits with the way we want to work, rather than being pushed into the main frame that might fit that modern way of medicine, which is very A to B, you know, black and white, and does not allow for the richness and diversity that we really want to include in our herbal training. So that was a really dramatic happening, and at the peak of that storm was these professors that were questioning us, saying, okay, I think we get them. I think we've got the whole picture now. That's fine. Okay, we got it.
Great.
It was really incredible.
Oh, and that they got it, and that many of your students got it, and actually currently modern herbal medicine, this present day herbal medicine, is seeking and embracing and exploring all of these aspects that we've talked about, the shamanism, the Goethean study, and we can include pharmacology and medical science. We include all of it and make it a creative, diverse study. And that's, as we started in the beginning, talking about how diverse and expansive this study really is, and this practices, and as the plants are. So we're just mirroring, the plants themselves, which are so diverse and dynamic and complex and philosophical and all of that. So you've touched on a lot of really thoughtful points there. And I'd like to end by just saying that I know now you've shifted into a new phase, that you've taken a lot of that with you. What are you offering now? Like, what is your current offering as a herbalist in this present?
Yeah. So when our degree program closed, which was in 2010, around the same time, there were a lot of other university degree courses popping up everywhere, not just in the UK, but here in North America as well. And so the scientific method was, and the theory, the theoretical approach of learning in a classroom was pretty much the norm and was covered by lots of other people. And so we felt that there was a gap amongst the practical, hands-on, experiential learning side of herbal medicine, because there's only so much you can learn in a classroom and out of a textbook, and why would you not want to be out with these masters who are communicating and doing it, so long as you can get past the non-verbal communication, then there's a lot there. And so we really felt that we wanted to offer that. And I lived on a herb farm on the Isle of Arran in Scotland for 15 years, and it was a wonderful environment for meeting wild plants, and then we cultivated a lot of plants as well. And people would come and immerse themselves in nature and learn from the plants and learn from food as medicine. So it would be a residential experience. We started with weekend courses, and then from demand, really, we offered then a residential apprenticeship, and that ran for I ran that for 4 years on Arran, and then, having lived in Scotland for 25 years in the cold and the damp, I figured it was time to dry out, and I moved to Portugal with my Portuguese partner, and we're now learning about the plants that live in the hot and dry climates of the Mediterranean and the south of the Atlantic, coming into just before the Mediterranean. You still have the Atlantic, which is actually the sea we have in the Portuguese coast. So what's really interesting is that people who come to these, we run 2-month-long apprenticeships, one in the summer, one in the autumn, and one in the spring, because that's when the indigenous plants of the wild plants of Portugal are at their best, when you've got the late spring rains and before the heat of the summer dries them all out. So we have such a wide range of people. I have a lot of already qualified herbalists coming on these apprenticeships because they don't feel they have the confidence to set up in practice, or they don't really know what a lot of the herbs even look like. They call themselves, we've had a brown bottle herbalist training, so they really want to know what these plants that they measure out as tinctures actually look like. And then that opens up a whole other level of relationship with the plant, and they really get to know the plant, so that they are so much more confident to recommend that to somebody else. And one of the main things that I feel is really important is that you really need to have met the plant and have a relationship with the plant, and that includes maybe dieting on it yourself, or at least tasting the tea and using that all those different interactive tools, so that you really know that plant and you have a direct experience, and then you don't forget that.
Truly, and I won't forget the experience with gumweed yesterday here in the garden, and it really sticks when we spend time with the plants. If we're going to be a voice for the plants, we have to know the plants well, and that does include, coming out here and sitting with them, as we've done for this conversation. And so, Maureen, what is the name of your current herbal school or herbal garden in Portugal? How would people find you?
We're called the Herbal Path, and Herbal Path Portugal. And we have a website called theherbalpath.net, and we really, really have a big celebration with the aromatic plants in particular, because these plants that produce all these wonderful volatile oils, essential oils that we know of as having top, middle and base notes, and we know that they are vibrating at different frequencies which give them a high evaporation rate or a low evaporation rate if it's from a wood, for example, like sandalwood or cedarwood. So we know that these plants are vibrating at different frequencies and at different notes. And my partner Jose, who's a musician, we are now doing this really interesting experiment of what is the crossover between medicinal plants and music as healing modalities from the same source, which is the vibrational phenomena of existence, and sound and the vibrational resonance of music have a very powerful healing effect when people go to a nightclub and they're really rocking with the DJ and they feel so good when they come out, that's a medicine. Or if people have a sound bath with Tibetan bowls and gongs, and that's another really strong effect on the body and on the harmony, on the harmonics of the body. And so sound healing and music as medicine is a really obvious kind of partnership with the medicinal plants and their ability for healing as well. And so that's what we're really exploring, this fusion between the vibrational phenomenon of healing through music and through plants, because it's all about the same vibrational harmonics.
I love that you're a student again and again and again. You're learning from a new landscape, as we do as herbalists. We're continual students, and yet you're teaching and offering all that you've learned over these 30 or more years as a herbalist in a new location. And that program sounds great. I hope I can get there someday and study with you.
Visit us in Portugal.
Thank you. And I'm so glad you could visit us here in Nova Scotia at the Gasborough Herbal Farm and Botanical Sanctuary, and we were blessed to have you here to share, and thank you for sharing with our community on this video, and we wish you good, safe green travels back home.
Thank you, it's been a pleasure.
Thank you.